Please welcome Martin Williams.
Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking through one of these, I hope you'll excuse if it's a bit clunky, but I'll do my best. So thanks everybody for hanging out for the last talk of the day. I believe this is the end of it. Before Richard and his film come up a little bit later. You can hear me okay? Everybody right? All right, so it might seem a bit perverse of me to be speaking about this topic at the end of a day full of psilocybin talk, and particularly after Kane's amazing talk, but I thought I would maybe explore a little bit beyond psilocybin. And the reason for that is that as I hope to explain a little bit in the course of this talk, there's been something of a fixation on psilocybin, which I don't resent in any way. I don't have any issues with it, but I think there's a whole galaxy of psychedelics that exist beyond psilocybin, and so it's been a little bit of a thing for me to consider the prospects and the options as we could move forward, not only in the clinical context but also beyond into the non-clinical. Now, having said that, of course, I think we all agree that there's been extensive exploration beyond psilocybin in the non-clinical context, so I won't be saying anything particularly new or insightful, I think, for a lot of people here in any case. So just by way of context, and I will speak primarily in the clinical sort of sense, there's clearly a sort of a several decades history and track record of psychedelic assisted therapy, pretty much stemming from the discovery of the effects of LSD by Albert Hofmann in 1943. It didn't take too long for Sandoz and a number of psychiatrists and psychotherapists who were active in the day to start to explore the potential, the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. And so one thing I need to say all the way through here is that I'm referring to the classic psychedelics, which are the serotonergic psychedelics such as LSD or psilocybin or mescaline or a number of similar compounds, rather than MDMA and so on and so forth. Now, following that sort of 70-year track record of history of psychedelic-assisted therapy, we have had what's been dubbed a psychedelic renaissance. Whether or not it's a true renaissance is open to debate, because I think there have been some people pushing the barrow of the renaissance for a little while now. But all that said, I think it does represent a significant development in psychotherapy and psychiatry and the treatment of people who are experiencing mental health conditions. So why psilocybin? Psilocybin's interesting because it is the prototypic psychedelic. It's actually as a compound which acts at the serotonin, primarily at the serotonin receptors. It is very close chemically to serotonin, and so that's why we call it a prototypic psychedelic. LSD is in many ways as effective. It has certain advantages and certain other disadvantages compared with psilocybin, but it does have a very heavy cultural baggage, which, as many people will be aware, came about during the counter-cultural revolution of the 1960s and early 70s. And so LSD has been bypassed in this sort of new wave of research and clinical practice for a number of reasons, but primarily because of that sort of just the scaremongering that took place over an extensive period of time. And there are many dimensions to that I just don't have time to get into. So psilocybin still has a lot of potential in a therapeutic sense, but of course there's a lot of the classic psychedelic sort of repertory that also has huge potential for exploration. So just a very brief history. Of course, we have to acknowledge, and we willingly and happily acknowledge, that there's a very deep indigenous context and a deep indigenous prehistory of psychedelic use. Of course, entirely in the use of plant-based or natural-based psychedelic compounds. But it wasn't until the 20th century that the Western world, of course, discovered psychedelics, and then there was a fairly rapid development, because this really coincided with a whole lot of developments in chemistry and biochemistry and in psychiatry, which meant that we in the Western sort of world had a real thirst for knowledge and a thirst to understand the deeper sort of workings of our minds, and we're also discovering at the same time how chemical compounds and chemical agents could modulate the workings of our minds. And so with the dawning of the 20th century, mescaline, of course, was long known to the First Nations people in the Americas, in the northern part of the Americas. But it was only discovered by the West and explored by Arthur Hefter from 1896 onwards. It was another 40 years or so, and the mescaline sort of period really was a sort of a first flourishing of, I guess, the first wave of psychedelic research. It was another sort of 45 years before the discovery of the effects of LSD sort of took place by Albert Hofmann in Switzerland, and that really opened up that whole sort of that Pandora's box of psychedelic possibilities. The effects of psilocybin were noted by an American investment banker, as it happened, and it was made known to the West in the late 50s. And in fact, it was Albert Hofmann who had discovered the effects of LSD, in fact synthesized LSD previous to that, who characterized and then synthesized psilocybin. So 1957 is sort of the pivotal year during which this whole sort of story turned. Now, moving on through sort of the history of psychedelics, MDMA was sort of it was originally synthesized in 1912, as far as we know, but its effects were really found and characterized in human in the 70s, and it was used quite quickly in psychotherapeutic sort of practice, in clinical practice, before it was scheduled rather suddenly in the mid 80s. And then 2CB is another one that I will discuss briefly a little bit later. That is an analog of mescaline. It's a purely synthetic compound. It was synthesized in the course of a big exploration of psychedelic effects and chemistry by Alexander Shulgin, Sasha Shulgin, in the 1980s in this particular case. So at the dawn of psychiatry, psychedelics were considered to be the new wave, the new frontier, because they had an effect on our psyche, on our on our human psychology that had never been experienced before. And so it was considered to have great potential, partly in terms of modelling how our minds work. I'm not saying how our brains work at this stage, although it's very interesting to see how light can be shed on how our brains work as well. But in the psychiatric context, then psychedelics were considered to be very, very promising in terms of understanding psychopathology and then potentially treating these psychological mental health conditions. The term psychedelic assisted therapy, I don't know when it was actually sort of coined as such, but it has become sort of the standard sort of term for the use of psychedelics in the context of psychotherapy, and it doesn't necessarily have to be psychotherapy, but generally so. And so it brings together those two worlds of pharmacotherapies, or the use of pharmaceutical agents, with psychotherapeutic interventions. As far as the conditions that we regard as being amenable to treatment using psychedelics, then you can see that these are generally mood disorders and conditions which we regard as being associated generally with a rigidification, a rather sort of calcification or rigidification of thought processes. So distress, depression, anxiety, in some cases, or in all cases OCD, but in some cases substance use disorders also fall into this sort of pattern of mental sort of thought processes and behaviours. Now, interestingly enough, eating disorders and what we call body dysmorphia also fall into that. And what they generally mean is that the person experiencing these conditions will have a rather sort of inflexible sort of conception of themselves, their place in the world, and the situation that might be facing them at the time. Interestingly enough, the next one on the list is functional neurological disorders, and we don't really have a good understanding of these disorders, but they're the sorts of things such as paralysis, which doesn't have a neurological basis, and certain other sort of things which normally would be regarded as physical problems, but they don't have a clear physical basis. And so there's some interesting research into psilocybin assisted therapy in particular for these disorders. So we can look at these sort of common factors and underlying mechanisms which probably apply to psilocybin-assisted therapy, which of course could apply to broader classic psychedelic-assisted therapy as well. I'm really enjoying the jungle, by the way, so don't get me wrong on this, but yeah, I hope you guys can hear me over the drum and bass. So one thing we need to consider is that there are certain sort of classes of mental health conditions which at this particular point seem to be resistant or intractable or refractory to psychedelic-assisted therapies, and those tend to be in the psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia and related disorders. A significant range of personality disorders, and we don't really quite understand what the potential is for the use of psychedelic therapies to treat these. And then bipolar is an interesting one on its own because the depressive aspects of bipolar disorder may be amenable to psychedelic therapies, but the manic aspects may be exacerbated and potentiated by psychedelic therapies. So what I'm trying to do is just sort of paint a bit of a broader sort of contextual sort of background to where I'm heading here. Just briefly, we're still sort of discovering or hypothesizing how psychedelic-assisted therapies work. And many of you might have heard of this default mode network, the DMN, which is generally our sort of it's our self-referential sort of network. So it's actually a sort of a neurological network of regions within the brain which seem to communicate in a coordinated fashion and which have a lot to do with our sense of self, our sense of reflection, and in certain mental health conditions, which I've been referring to a couple of minutes ago, such as depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder, they tend to be those network processes tend to be heightened and increased in intensity to the extent that they start to dominate a lot of other normal sort of aspects of our thought processes. And so the trick really would be to try and address this imbalance of the overactivity of the default mode network. And it's been found neurophysiologically that psychedelics can assist in toning down that overactivity. Some other aspects of the psychedelic experience which may have therapeutic potential or relevance are an apparent correlation between the intensity of the mystical aspects of a psychedelic experience, and people who are familiar with the space, and I assume a fair few of you will be, can attest that there's a mystical aspect to a psychedelic experience which in many cases can correlate with an increase or an improvement in our mood generally and a number of aspects of our lives more broadly. The idea of ego dissolution is this loss of our that boundary between ourselves and everything around us, which can be as local as our immediate environment, but it can also extend to the universal environment as well. And there are other therapeutic elements which we're still exploring in terms of the therapeutic alliance, the sense of making sense of the whole process and how that could enable us to solve the problems that we perceive in our own lives. And there's also
we're off to the old method, guys. Until we can fix that.
just yell.
Careful, there's a speaker behind you, so if you hold it on this side.
Cool, thanks. Is that all right? Hear me all right?
I'll find batteries.
Are you asleep yet? Cool. So the next thing is this, there are neurophysiological sort of aspects of this which we're still sort of coming to understand, but neuroplasticity is a thing. Certainly experimentally it's been established that classic psychedelics, as well as a number of other compounds including ketamine, can bring about some significant regeneration of connections between neurons in our brain, which in many cases appear to have deteriorated in the course of some of these mental health conditions. All right, so we have what we call sort of, spines are the sort of the little protuberances from our neurons themselves. They develop into neurites and then eventually synapses. They appear to have been deteriorating in the course of depression, anxiety, and so on, and even substance use, so addictions and substance use disorders. And it has been shown in preclinical and in animal models, not necessarily yet in human models, because we don't have a way of carving up a human brain, a living human brain at this stage, to see if these things are actually happening, or even a deceased human brain at this stage. But nonetheless, it does appear that there's a regeneration of these connections. So we've talked a little bit for some of the people who have been attending some of the talks earlier today. There's both the psychological sort of impact of psychedelic therapies, but there's potentially also the physiological effects of these, which may come into play. That's very much work in progress, but there's some really, really interesting work going on at this stage at the moment. So the next question is, why are we so interested in psilocybin? And there's a number of reasons, of course, for that. As I mentioned before, it's the prototypic psychedelic, so chemically it's very, very close to serotonin. And so it essentially presents no significant physiological challenge to our systems. We have the wherewithal in our bodies to break down psilocybin as easily as we can break down and metabolize serotonin, and that represents quite a significant medical sort of plus in terms of its safety profile. It is a natural product. We know that as Kane and others today have so amply demonstrated, it exists in abundance in nature. It has a very low toxicity for the reason that I mentioned a couple of moments ago, but also psilocybin, along with some of the associated psychedelics, does, and the word that I'll use here is tryptamine psychedelics, and that's a particular subclass of organic compounds. They appear to elicit a particular depth and intensity of experience, which is, I wouldn't say it's unique by any means, but it is very characteristic of this class of psychedelics. One thing about psilocybin is that it sort of hits the sweet spot of duration of experience or action. So it's pharmacokinetics, the rate at which it's absorbed by the body and then passes through the body, metabolized, and then disappears out through our excretory systems, is sort of in that sort of 4 to 6 to 8 hour period. And that sort of fits the bill quite well from a therapeutic context. It means basically that the experience is long enough for it to have a lasting impact, but it's not so long that it ends up being exhausting both to the patient and to the therapists themselves. And it also has a very steady sort of effect in the system. So it is, it has what we call a fairly linear kinetics. So basically, as you increase the dose, the intensity of the experience increases and the duration of the experience increases in a fairly predictable manner. But that sort of 6 to 8 hour period is pretty much the sort of the time frame which seems to fit therapeutic applications as well as working out well for the participant overall. Now I'll touch on very briefly the prospect of shorter experiences which may be therapeutically useful, but we don't really have an answer to that one yet. Now the limitations of psilocybin, as I referred to a moment ago, is that it is a tryptamine psychedelic, which means that it has a certain quality or a load to the experience. And people who are well familiar with the space will be definitely grokking what I'm talking about at the moment. It can be quite challenging at times, and that is not always therapeutically particularly useful. And there are certain transcendent dimensions of the psilocybin experience which many people find very, very useful and fruitful, but some people in the therapeutic context can find quite challenging. These can lead to anxiety, particularly in the initiation of the experience, and then dysphoria, particularly when people gain insights that might be particularly challenging or difficult for them. And this can lead to problems, difficulties in making sense of the experience and then using the experience to sort of gain any therapeutic value as time goes on. And remember always at this particular point I'm talking about psilocybin in the context of psychotherapy for the treatment of mental health conditions. So the question arises, could other psychedelics, classic psychedelics, provide us with similar sorts of therapeutic outcomes? And so how should we go about sort of assessing these alternatives in terms of their therapeutic potential? So from our point of view, the main considerations in terms of assessing a new therapeutic agent, of course, are safety, physical safety, psychological safety as well. The efficacy in treating the conditions that we're hoping to address. We'd like to know how these compounds are actually working in our systems, and so as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, those sort of psychological aspects as well as the physiological aspects can be quite important. The duration of experience is quite important because some people find even a 6-hour experience just way too much for them, and they may gain all of the benefit that they would like to gain within a sort of a 2-hour time frame. But of course the question then arises, how long will these benefits possibly endure? And then of course the potential for non-clinical use that another spruik I'll be talking about tomorrow morning is could we be looking at some of these compounds for the benefit of the betterment of well people, so the benefit of us who generally don't have a particular mental health condition, but we all just carry the burden of everyday life. So there are certain sort of interesting questions to be addressed there. Now, as far as those risks that I mentioned before at the beginning, those sort of concerns about both physiological and psychological, I won't go through them in great detail here, but you can see that there's a range of physical risks that can be of concern to people who might have some physiological sort of issues. They might have cardiovascular problems. They might have liver or kidney insufficiency. They might have susceptibility to headaches, and in fact many people who are experiencing psilocybin assisted therapy, administered psilocybin assisted therapy may actually complain about headache and nausea and problems which actually really detract from the experience for them. And in terms of psychology, then anxiety and panic are very significant concerns for some people, and they can often take some real sort of input on the part of the therapist to address. And those other concerns in terms of existential issues, depersonalization, possibility of psychosis, all need to be acknowledged and addressed, avoided if at all possible for fairly obvious reasons, I would think. Now, the therapeutic aspects of psilocybin and other psychedelics sort of really come down to the quality of the experience, which I've called here phenomenology. The degree of intoxication refers to the capacity for the patient or the participant to interact with a therapist, to be able to take stock of their own situation and to do the kind of work that we regard as therapeutically useful. The duration of the experience, I don't want to keep banging on about it, but for some people, and particularly in the case of LSD, an 8 to 12 hour experience can be way too long for them to gain any particular benefit. And then the depth of mystical experience is interesting because it also relates to people's their predisposition to a mystical experience. And so, as I'll be talking about tomorrow, there's a number of people who have a particular sort of personal interest or a personal history or whatever in mystical or religious orientation. And so those people, interestingly enough, seem to show a more positive capacity for therapeutic benefit if they have a capacity for a mystical experience on psilocybin or other psychedelics. The great thing about classic psychedelics is that they don't impair our memory at all, or to any significant degree. The only caveat I'd say to that is that people who are having a fairly intense psychedelic experience can find that thoughts are really racing very hard, and it can take quite a long period of time for them to make sense of what they experienced and to start to recollect and to review it. And then finally, as I said, the persistence of effects really comes into play in a therapeutic context. So it's very important for people to achieve a longer-term remission of whatever mental health condition that they're experiencing. So moving from psilocybin, and there's a lot of chicken wire in this diagram, there's quite a number of quite closely related, chemically related compounds which have a very similar overall effect as psychedelics. And the reason for that is, not surprisingly, they have a similar pharmacological effect at the receptor system, the serotonin receptor system that we're interested in modulating. And so the first of these, and I'll go through them sort of class by class, but only very briefly. The phenethylamines are very interesting because they are separate from the tryptamines. They are a different class of compounds from psilocybin and LSD, as it happens, and they basically work in a very similar way. So they bind in a different fashion to that same receptor, but they do ultimately still affect the serotonin receptors, the 5-HT, the serotonin 2A and 2C receptors. So there's a list of compounds which I find particularly interesting. They haven't been explored to any degree in a therapeutic context, but I would personally I would be very interested to see some of these explored as time goes on. The last two that I'm talking about, the last two classes here are quite contentious, I'll admit that, because they do carry significant risks, but there's the scope to explore them in a therapeutic context in the right sort of conditions, so just bear that in mind. The next are the tryptamines, so psilocybin and LSD, or psilocybin in particular, belongs to that class of tryptamines. And let's see, where are we at? Tryptamines are generally down the bottom here. They're just slightly more complex molecules, but they do bind in the same sort of fashion to those receptors. But the thing here is that DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT may be known in concept and in fact as some of you, and they are being explored actively for mental health treatments. And DMT, as many of you will be aware, is the psychotropia or the psychedelic component of ayahuasca. 5-methoxy-DMT is something that is being explored increasingly and shows significant promise, but with some very significant differences from psilocybin and the phenethylamines. And then the ergolines are LSD and a number of other compounds which are being explored with a degree of sort of interest and avidity at the moment. LSD in particular, as many people will be aware, has a long experience. It can be very hard on the system, it can be very hard on the mind. But potentially, and as was discovered during that sort of first or second phase of psychedelic clinical research, could have great potential, and I think that should be re-explored. Many people might be thinking about the microdosing aspects of this. I won't really go into that in any detail at all today, but LSD does seem to be somewhat amenable to microdosing as well. And then finally, beta-carbolines are harmine and harmaline are the two the primary monoamine oxidase inhibitor compounds, which are the other part of the ayahuasca mixture, which many people might be familiar with. So I won't go into any particular detail here, but we do need to consider the pharmacological effects of all of these compounds, and they do vary quite dramatically. So all this is there's some really classic stuff being done in University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, basically screening a whole range of compounds against our known sort of our group of receptors of interest, and those are generally serotonin, dopamine, and adrenaline receptors, plus a bunch of others. So the first step in addressing any of these new non-psilocybin psychedelics would be to consider these, the pharmacology and the activity of these various compounds at the various receptors. Combinations is an interesting one. I mentioned hippie flip earlier today. And so there's plenty of scope to explore these particular combinations of MDMA with some of these classic psychedelics. And then there's another concept that many of you may be aware of, which is called the entourage effect, probably mainly in the context of cannabis and cannabinoids. But there's this sort of idea that perhaps some of these compounds may not have much effect in their own right, but they might actually increase the effects of some of the classic psychedelics. So that's where we're interested in exploring those combinations. So, last couple of slides, there's a very active community researching these various compounds at the moment, and there's some very interesting work going into exploring totally new chemical compounds. So we have like several hundred psychedelics that we know probably work to a degree, but there's also, for various reasons nowadays, there's quite a lot of interest in exploring totally new compounds. And so there's what we would regard as the standard drug discovery pathway in a pharmaceutical development sense, which is also, for better or worse, applicable to psychedelic treatment or compound development. So the steps that I'm referring to here are, in particular, that receptor screening. Receptor screening is what I referred to a moment ago. Elaborating those initial sort of compounds to lead compounds, and then moving from rodent models, for example, into human clinical research. And so potentially, unfortunately, this is usually a 10 to 20 year period of development, but nonetheless, it's the kind of work that needs to be done if we are to expect new psychedelics to come into use. There are other aspects, of course, which is the scheduling of psychedelics, and globally psychedelic compounds are largely totally prohibited. They're placed in the most restrictive drug schedules around the world. And so what we need to be considering is the strategies of approving and registering these new compounds as medicines rather than as poisons. And the line between poisons and medicines is often very, very close, or very narrow, as many people might be aware. So there's an increasing number of clinical trials taking place in Australia and, of course, globally. And another slide that I could put up, but I won't, is that there are dozens of clinical trials now exploring psilocybin in particular for a range of mental health conditions and, in fact, some physical health conditions. But what we really need to see, from my perspective, is exploration of these other compounds, such as DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, mescaline, and some of the analogues. Some of the combinations, as I've mentioned a couple of moments ago, and ketamine's a whole other world, of course. So very interesting and promising field. But I'm not sure if you are aware that ketamine is actually not the only one drug in its class of compounds at all. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of analogues of ketamine, all of which could be explored for therapeutic application. And then finally, just there's a little bit of a personal anecdote. Because I'm so obsessed with this subject, I actually coordinated a particular special topic issue of one of the psychiatry journals, and that was Beyond Psilocybin, not surprisingly. We launched that in 2023, and over a period of sort of 6 to 9 months, we received 10 manuscripts and accepted 8, and we closed that. But interestingly enough, and I was a bit disappointed, just how limited the global research field is in these alternative psychedelics. And so in a way, this is a bit of a sort of a spruik for more interest globally in exploring compounds, classic psychedelics beyond psilocybin. Funnily enough, we did receive 2 or 3 manuscripts that were still on psilocybin, even though the theme was beyond psilocybin, which I found pretty entertaining. But of course, happily, we did receive a couple of manuscripts on DMT, 5-MeO, and so on. Clavine alkaloids are in the class of LSD, and that was really exciting to see that somebody at least is thinking about exploring the LSD class of psychedelics. And there are a couple of ketamine papers which came in as well. So look, it was a very interesting experience. It was a rather it was a very sobering experience to see that there still isn't so much work being done, but I live in hope. So as far as the way ahead, I do hope that we can sort of expand our perspective somewhat. I think we do need to consider at all times where psychedelics fit into these contexts of politics and social aspects. Psilocybin, as I said before, is probably universally acceptable at this stage. It's the most acceptable and palatable of classic psychedelics. And that's essentially strategically why the original researchers started with psilocybin rather than LSD and any number of other compounds. The research and development aspects, there's a lot of scope, and so I think all we need to do is unfortunately put some funding into it, but also to start to sort of look at the limitations of psilocybin to explore new possibilities. In this day and age, for better or worse, there are intellectual property considerations which are in many ways an impediment to research. But on the other hand, it could be regarded as a positive for companies, research groups and labs to start exploring some totally novel compounds which haven't been explored or invented before. And so I think if we can expand this sort of research and development area beyond just tinkering at the edges of the current sort of field, then I think that could be a positive. And that, of course, could lead to some financial benefits for those who are prepared to make that investment. Just reiterating, we need to keep front of mind at all times the safety and the efficacy of these compounds in the therapeutic context. And then finally, we talked a bit earlier today about the potential for translation for these compounds, particularly psilocybin and MDMA at this stage, from the lab into clinical practice. And then I think we could move even beyond that, as I'll talk about tomorrow, into what I regard as preventive mental health and the maintenance of mental good health or well-being. And so I think there's a number of compounds, and probably mescaline comes to mind immediately, and some of those mescaline analogues, which appear to have a gentler, lighter touch, and which might be regarded as a more sort of positive and progressive way to maintain our mental good health, the way we take a car to the workshop once a year just for its standard annual maintenance. And I think if we can start to look at psychedelics in that way, that'll add a whole nother dimension beyond the treatment of mental ill health or mental health conditions, and potentially to have a much broader potential for the betterment of well people and humankind overall. So thank you very much. I have no idea how long that took, so if you want to ask any questions, please do.
I've got a mic if people want to amplify against the dancers.
No, just start emceeing, that's all right.
Yeah, we can hear you quite well in front of the speakers.
Thank you very much. Jim Mowbray, thanks for the presentation, ma'am. It's a question from me. What protections exist in a clinical setting to help mitigate risks of a bad trip per se, and how could you translate that to advice for, say, a first-time underground user?
So the first thing to say is that the clinical trials, and I'll talk about clinical trials first and then sort of discuss that translation into broader medical use. The clinical trials at the moment have very, very strict selection criteria, so anybody who has any sort of inkling of a sort of a high blood pressure or a cardiovascular issue, or some issues with their kidney or liver, for example, are not likely to be accepted for participation in clinical trials. Now, things are likely to change, and I'll hopefully talk about that in another, if anybody's still with me in a year's time. I'd like to talk about that more, because that's a real consideration in treating people with real mental health conditions in the real world, and that's really an important thing to consider. So from that perspective, we try and cast that safety net around people to make sure that they're not at undue risk that could be avoided because we just want to avoid risk at all costs. Now that, as I say, as we move into the hospital or the clinical environment, may change, will have to change because we discussed earlier today the kinds of costs involved in psychedelic assisted therapy, and also the imperative for, well, we didn't discuss it, but there is an imperative for commercial clinics to be able to treat people, so they can't just keep excluding everybody. So we just have to be more judicious, I think, in our selection of people. Now, to your question about people who are working outside the clinical context, and I was actually grappling earlier today about, with the, as we all do, I think, with the idea of underground versus sort of beyond clinical or whatever it might be. But anyway, you get my drift. But anyway, I think this is really important to consider because in many cases, the people who are administering non-clinical sort of psychedelic experiences don't have the background, they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the framework, they don't have the concerns about safety that people who are working in the research or medical field would. And so I'm sorry to keep banging on about tomorrow's talk, but there's so many things that I can cover tomorrow. But look, I think we need to consider safety at all costs, and I think one thing that concerns me about some of the non-clinical applications is the number of people attending ceremony, and I think there is a limit to the number of people that any given group of facilitator and attendants could possibly manage. And we've seen that tragically in the last few weeks, I'm sorry to say. Now, whether that particular incident, and some people may not be aware of this, but whether that particular incident could have been avoided with a smaller group of people, with a higher qualified facilitator or whatever, I have no idea. But I do think we need to bear those sorts of things in mind for the safety of people who are coming in and essentially paying money for these experiences, which I acknowledge and absolutely support could be very, very positively life-changing as well.
Your next question?
Just curious to know if you can speak a little bit to what the future might look like for psychedelic assisted therapy in Australia or in the world, particularly in light of, I think it was mentioned in the panel today, we're mostly talking about clinical use of these psychedelics, but there is also that other piece of what you might call nature-based sorts of healing experiences. Do you think there might be a future where we can see elements from both the scientific approach and also a more sort of grassroots, earth-based sort of almost energetic type healing experience that people can also access readily? Sure. Do you think that's on the cards for the future and what that could look like?
Definitely on the cards for the future, yeah, no question. But I think that a real thing to think about is that as humans, we tend to be pretty good problem solvers, and so unless there's a problem that's identified, and in many cases, and just think about the big thing around us that is the elephant in the room, climate change and sort of environmental challenge. Unless it's really in the front of our faces, then in many cases we will just keep pushing that down the road. So what I'm trying to say there is that mental health conditions are a relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of a problem that could be addressed. We're doing what we can as a humanity to address mental health conditions, but with limited success, so we're looking for alternatives. The bigger, broader pictures of the betterment of well people, as you're probably referring to a degree, that's a little bit further down the track, and I think we need to identify that the betterment of well people, which is worthy of consideration and worthy of changing laws, implementing safeguards and so on, or otherwise just leaving us all to our own devices, which to a certain degree we have the capacity, fortunately in Australia, to do. We're living, I have to stress, we're living in a relatively liberal and permissive, in the positive sense, permissive sort of cultural context here in Australia. Whether that is formalised is another question. I would hope that it might be formalised in a positive sense without being over-regulated, and that's something I would ideally like to see us avoid. Does that answer the question, or any other aspects I missed?
That was a great answer, yeah. I mean, I guess just if in your sort of wildest dreams, in some sense, what would you imagine the future could look like for people accessing these medicines, really? If there's anything you wanted to add to that, but otherwise, appreciate the answer.
Yeah, no worries. Look, I'd like us all to be brilliant and very insightful and have all the answers to our problems. That might be a little way off, I'm not quite sure, but I think one thing that we have the capacity to do as individuals is actually address our individual problems, and I think that's what we tend to do. Addressing things as a community or as a humanity is a bigger question and a bigger challenge, and I don't think any of us could. Well, I certainly don't have much faith in humanity as a collective to be able to address the current issues. And so the old think globally, act locally is I think probably a good start in this regard. And thinking globally, acting locally in the psychedelic sense is a pretty good way to look at it. Yeah.
Just a quick question. It'd be interesting, for me, to hear more about the growth of ketamine and the various analogs, and knowing that they use it in babies in healthcare, babies, so it's pretty safe as well as adults. And I presume there's no plant that has ketamine in it.
No, ketamine, as far as I know, ketamine and the whole class of aryl cyclohexamines is an entirely synthetic class of compounds. So I can't think of any natural product analogue of ketamine. And in fact, interestingly enough, Simon, are you in the room somewhere? I can't see you there, but I suspect that there aren't too many true dissociative anesthetics, which are the class to which ketamine belongs, that exist in nature either, strangely enough. So I can't really, on the top of my head, I can't really point to any. Anyway, so ketamine's fascinating because it acts on a different receptor system from the classic psychedelics. Strangely enough, and we're still trying to discover, and it's an off-again, on-again kind of research sort of enterprise, but it could be that the receptor system that ketamine works at is closely associated with the receptor system that classic psychedelics work at, and we still don't quite understand how that works, but they might just like cuddle up and hang out, and that's a really interesting sort of concept. All that said, ketamine works by calming down the glutamate receptors, the NMDA receptors, which otherwise can cause significant damage if they're allowed to sort of run free. Okay, so it's possible that ketamine works by calming down or quietening down this whole other receptor system, and then enabling the mind to sort of just go free in that dissociative sort of way. Classic psychedelics, of course, in some ways do tone down some receptor sort of network, or these networks that we're talking about before, but it's not clear whether they're the same, similar, or quite different. So I can't really explain that. Now, one good thing about ketamine and that sort of that class of NMDA receptors is that they are extremely effective as dissociative anesthetics, and so hence they can be used in neonates and small children, as well as adults who have experienced very significant trauma, because ketamine almost uniquely, or the ketamine class, doesn't suppress respiration to the same degree by any means as opiates and so on. So it's a very very safe anesthetic in trauma care. Now, we're still coming to understand ketamine's action, but of course, as I said before, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other compounds which are quite similar to ketamine, which, in the same sort of manner that I mentioned earlier in my talk, have widely different pharmacokinetics, which means ketamine generally, if it's administered in the standard sort of 100 milligram dose intramuscularly, has about a 40 to 60 minute sort of activity. There are some which will last several hours, and there are some which will last several minutes by comparison. And so I think there's a lot of scope to explore the whole range of ketamine analogues in the same way that I'm proposing that we explore the range of analogues of classic psychedelics such as psilocybin and mescaline.
Thank you. Any other questions, anybody? I'm walking over now.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, if you were able, which of these compounds would be the first first compound you'd like to study in the future, and what would be a basic question or protocol you'd have? What would you like to test?
Could you repeat the question?
Which of these substances would you most like to do research with, and what would the research be?
2,4-TFM is really interesting to me because my PhD was on a class of compounds which had the trifluoromethyl group. 2,4-B is an obvious answer because 2,4-B is it's a sort of a chemical analogue of mescaline, and so mescaline's there, 2,4-B's hanging out there. They are really quite similar, and 2,4-B is effective in a lower dose than mescaline. It has a shorter duration, and there's a really interesting, really nice research paper that's come out recently directly comparing the effects of 2,4-B with psilocybin at comparable doses. I think they didn't quite hit the sweet spot of 2,4-B versus psilocybin in dose terms, but they did explore it really quite well. They looked at the physiological and psychological effects as well as some of the phenomenological or experiential effects, and so that was a nice paper coming out of Maastricht in the Netherlands. And I think 2,4-B, 2CI, so some of those quite closely chemically related compounds could have great potential. And in fact, they were used sort of semi-therapeutically, semi-underground in the 80s and 90s before they were identified by the authorities and scheduled. And they were very widespread in Europe and the US, and they were available in Australia. And so those are the kinds of starting points, I think. The reason I mentioned TFM is that it's chemically similar, but it's actually active in a tenth of the dose of 2.